The hollow where I grew up is called Fenwick, though you will not find it on most maps. It is an unincorporated community in the mountains of Pocahontas County, West Virginia, which is a polite way of saying it is a handful of houses on a gravel road in a crease between two ridges where the rest of the world forgot to look. The nearest town with a grocery store is almost 40 minutes away, on roads that wind through the mountains like they are trying to shake you off. Cell service does not reach the bottom of the hollow. Mail comes on a rural route. The houses are scattered along a creek called Shade Run, some visible from the road, some set back on driveways that disappear into the trees. Maybe 15 families in 3 miles of hollow. That is the whole community. My name is Owen Dre. I am 26 years old. I left Fenwick at 18 for college in Morgantown, and I have been living in Northern Virginia ever since, working as an electrician, building a life in the kind of place where the lights never go all the way off and the noise never goes all the way quiet. I had not been home in almost 3 years when my father called. My father is not a man who calls. Warren Dre communicates through action, through the things he does and the things he does not do, and a phone call means something has crossed the threshold from manageable to necessary. What had crossed the threshold was his shoulder, an old injury from a road grading accident that had finally deteriorated to the point of requiring surgery. He needed someone at the house for a few days while he recovered. He did not ask me to come. He stated the situation and let the silence do the asking. I said I would be there Friday. The drive south from Northern Virginia takes about 4.5 hours. The last 45 minutes on progressively narrower roads that climb through the mountains and then drop into the hollow along Shade Run. I had made the drive dozens of times, but not recently, and the familiarity came back in layers as I crossed into Pocahontas County. The air changed first, cooler and thinner, carrying the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke and the mineral coldness of creek water running over limestone. Then the road narrowed and the trees closed in until the canopy met overhead and the light went green and dim. Then the hollow itself, the feeling of descending into something, of the world folding shut around me like a book closing. The house was the same. Small frame construction, metal roof, set back from the gravel road on a flat spot above the creek. Behind the house, the forest began immediately, climbing the eastern ridge in a wall of timber so thick and steep that sunlight only reached the back porch for about 2 hours in the middle of the day. I grew up in the shadow of that ridge. I knew every trail on it for the first half mile. Beyond that, the forest became something else, denser, quieter, older. The trees were massive. The canopy blocked the sky. The undergrowth thinned out because so little light reached the floor, and what remained was a cathedral of grey trunks and deep silence, and the feeling of being very small in a very old place. Beyond that first half mile was where the rules applied. My father was on the porch when I pulled in. He looked older than 3 years should account for. The shoulder was visibly bothering him. His left arm held close to his body in the unconscious way of a man who has been managing pain so long it has become posture. We greeted each other the way Dre men greet each other. A handshake, a nod, a few words that carried more than their weight. We ate dinner. We talked about the surgery, the recovery, the logistics. Normal things. After dinner, as the light faded and the hollow filled with shadow, the way a bowl fills with dark water, I stepped onto the back porch to smoke a cigarette. I looked at the tree line behind the house. It was close, maybe 60 yards from the porch to the first trunks. In the fading light, the forest was already dark. Not evening dark, deep dark. The kind of dark that has texture, that you can feel on your face like cold air leaking through a crack in a wall. My father came to the door behind me. He said it the way he had said it every evening of my childhood that I could remember, casually, without emphasis, as if it were no different from reminding me to turn off the stove. He said, "Come inside before full dark." He was not looking at me when he said it. He was looking at the tree line. I finished my cigarette and went inside. The rules. I grew up with them. They were never written down, never posted on the wall, never formalized in any way. They were spoken, repeated, enforced with the quiet authority of a father who did not explain his reasons because the rules predated his reasons. I learned them the way I learned everything else about living in the hollow, through repetition and obedience and the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from watching adults follow the same instructions every day of their lives without complaint. Do not go into the woods after dark, not the yard, not the edge of the tree line, the woods. Once the sun is down, the trees are off limits until morning. If you hear something moving in the forest at night, do not go to the window to look. Stay where you are. If the sound comes closer to the house, go to the interior room and close the door. If someone knocks on the door after dark and you are not expecting anyone, do not answer it. Call out and ask who it is. If they do not answer, do not open the door. If you hear your name called from the woods at night, it is not a person calling you. Do not respond. Do not go outside. Once a year, in October, leave a cord of split firewood at the edge of the tree line behind the house. Do not watch what takes it. By morning, it will be gone. I followed the rules because my father followed them and because every other family in the hollow followed them too. As a child, I accepted them the way children accept gravity. As a teenager, I resented them the way teenagers resent anything that limits their freedom. As an adult who left for college and built a life 4 hours away, in a place where the woods were parks and the dark was a dimmer switch between streetlights, I filed them away as the eccentricities of an isolated community that had been telling itself stories for so long. The stories had hardened into tradition. I do not believe that anymore. I slept in my old bedroom that first night. The room faces east toward the ridge. The window looks out at the tree line, close enough that on a windy night you can hear branches tapping the glass. I fell asleep quickly, tired from the drive, and I slept deeply until something woke me around 2 in the morning. It was not a sound that woke me. It was the absence of sound. The hollow at night has a voice. The creek running over rocks. Insects in the warm months. Wind moving through the canopy. Owls calling across the ridges. Coyotes yipping in the distance. The occasional crack of a branch under the weight of a deer. It is not quiet. It is layered and constant. a low murmur of living things doing what living things do in the dark. That voice had stopped, every layer of it, all at once, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire hollow. The creak was still audible, faintly, but everything else was gone. No insects, no wind, no animals. The silence had a quality I recognized from childhood, though I had not thought about it in years. A held-breath quality, the feeling of an entire landscape going still at the same moment and waiting for something to pass. Then I heard movement in the forest behind the house. Not an animal. I grew up in these woods. I know what a deer sounds like moving through brush, what a bear sounds like shouldering through laurel thickets, what a coyote sounds like trotting a game trail. This was none of those things. The movement was slow and heavy and rhythmic. Footsteps, something walking through the timber on two legs, moving along the ridge above the house at a pace that was steady and unhurried. The footfalls had weight to them, not the crunch of a person on a leaf-covered trail. A deeper sound, a compression of earth and debris that suggested something significantly heavier than a person, but moving with the same bipedal rhythm. Left, right, steady as a clock. The sound traveled from south to north along the ridge behind the house. I lay in bed and listened to it pass. It took about 3 minutes from the time I first heard it until it faded into the distance to the north. Then the silence held for another minute, heavy and total. Then, gradually, the insects came back. The wind returned. The hollow resumed its breathing. I did not get up. I did not go to the window. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and I did not move until the first grey light appeared in the east and the birds started calling, and the world rebuilt itself into something ordinary. In the morning, I walked the tree line behind the house. The leaves were thick on the ground, and I could not see distinct footprints. But on the slope above the house, running roughly north to south along the contour of the ridge, there was a track, a path about 3 feet wide, where the leaf litter had been compressed and pushed aside by something heavy passing through repeatedly. The exposed ground underneath was packed firm. This was not a path made by one passage. This was a trail worn by regular use over weeks or months. Something had been walking that route along the ridge behind my father's house, and it had been doing it often enough to wear the ground bare. I drove up the hollow that afternoon to see Cleda Shires. Cleda was the oldest person in the community, late 70s, born in the hollow, had never lived anywhere else. She occupied a particular position in Fenwick that I did not fully understand as a child, but that I recognize now as something like authority. The other families deferred to her on matters that fell outside the ordinary. She had known my grandmother. She had known everyone's grandmother. Her house sat about a half-mile deeper into the hollow than ours, on a flat spot where the creek bent and the road curved to follow it. She was on her porch in a heavy sweater, watching the ridge across the hollow with the automatic, unfocused attention of someone who has been doing it for 50 years. I sat with her. I told her about the sound in the night, the footsteps along the ridge. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the tree line. She told me that what I heard had been walking the ridges above the hollow for as long as her family had been in Fenwick. 6 generations. She said her grandmother called it the Ridge Walker, though the name did not matter. What mattered was the understanding, The woods belonged to it after dark. The hollow, the houses, the road, the creek, those belonged to the people. But the forest, from the tree line to the top of the ridge and everything between, that was not human territory after sundown. She said it was not hostile. Not exactly. It had never come into a house. It had never attacked anyone on the road or in the hollow. The people who followed the rules lived alongside it without incident, the way you live alongside a river that floods. You respect the boundary. You do not build in the floodplain. You do not go where the water goes. But she said people who broke the rules had experiences that changed them. She told me about a man named Grover Hull who lived in the hollow in the 1950s. Grover was a hunter who did not believe in the rules. One November evening, he went into the woods after dark to check a trap line. He came back 3 hours later, walked into his kitchen, sat down at the table, and did not speak for 2 days. When he finally talked, he would not say what he saw. He said only that he was not alone on the ridge, and that what was up there with him was not an animal and not a person, and was aware of him in a way that made him understand he had been tolerated his entire life without ever knowing it. Grover never went into the woods after dark again, died in 81, and was buried in the cemetery at the mouth of the hollow. His family still follows the rules. Then Cleda asked me something. She asked if my father had put out the firewood this year. I told her I did not know. She said October was almost over and it should have been done by now. She said Warren's shoulder had been bad for months and she was not sure he had been able to split and stack a full cord. She said the firewood mattered. She said it was not an offering. It was an acknowledgement, a way of saying we know you are here and we respect the arrangement. The wood was always gone by morning, she said. Not dragged away, not scattered, gone entirely, as if it had been lifted whole and carried into the forest without leaving a trace. She said the years when the wood was late, things changed in the hollow. The footsteps on the ridge came closer. The silence at night lasted longer. She said 1 year in the 70s, a family at the south end of the hollow forgot entirely, and every night for a week, they heard something standing on their porch, not knocking, not moving, just standing there, the boards creaking under a weight that held its position in the dark from full night until dawn. The family put their wood out the following October, and it never happened again. I went home and asked my father about the firewood. Warren was quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted he had not done it. His shoulder had been too bad to swing a maul for the past 2 months. He had been meaning to ask a neighbor for help, but his pride had gotten in the way pride does with men who have spent their lives handling things alone. I told him I would do it. He looked at me with an expression that was hard to read. Gratitude, mostly. But underneath it, something that looked like relief, so deep it had been pressing on him for weeks. I spent Saturday splitting and stacking firewood. A full cord is 128 cubic feet of wood. It is a lot of splitting. I worked with my father's maul and the old block behind the house, driving the blade through rounds of oak and hickory until my shoulders burned and my hands were raw. By late afternoon, I had a full cord stacked on a pallet at the edge of the tree line. 60 yards from the back porch, right where the mowed grass ended and the first trunks began. I finished as the light was going. The shadow of the eastern ridge had already swallowed the house. The tree line was darkening fast, the trunks fading into a wall of grey and black. I put them all in the shed and walked to the porch and looked at the firewood sitting on the boundary between the yard and the forest. A neat stack of split wood in the last thin light of an October afternoon. It looked ordinary. It looked like a chore completed. My father was at the door. "Come inside," he said. I went. That night, around midnight, I woke to the footsteps again. Closer this time. Not on the ridge. On the slope directly behind the house, coming downhill through the timber toward the yard. Heavy, rhythmic, deliberate. The same two-legged cadence I had heard the first night, but nearer. Close enough that I could hear the individual compression of each step in the leaf litter. The slight hesitation at the bottom of each footfall, where the weight settled before the next step lifted. The footsteps reached the bottom of the slope and stopped. I lay in bed, rigid, staring at the dark ceiling. The silence held. Then I heard a different sound. Wood being moved. The quiet thud and scrape of split logs being lifted and shifted. It was methodical, unhurried. The sound of something picking up the firewood I had stacked that afternoon and gathering it, piece by piece, with a care that struck me as deliberate. Then the footsteps again, moving uphill, back toward the ridge. Heavier now, loaded. The sound of something carrying a burden up the steep slope and into the deep timber above the house. It made 3 trips. I counted them by the sound. Down the slope, the steps lighter, empty-handed. The quiet work of gathering the wood. Then back up the slope, each footfall deeper, compressed under the weight it carried. 3 trips over about 45 minutes. The last trip ended with the footsteps fading into the upper timber, and then silence, and then, gradually, the insects and the wind and the creek, the hollow putting itself back together the way it always did after the silence passed. In the morning, the firewood was gone. The pallet was empty. The ground around it was undisturbed. No drag marks, no scattered bark. No broken branches on the slope where something had walked up and down 3 times in the dark, carrying 128 cubic feet of split oak and hickory up a 40-degree grade. The earth was smooth, the leaves were settled, the wood was simply gone, as if it had never existed. I stood at the empty pallet for a long time, and I listened to the birds singing in the canopy above me, and I felt something I had not felt since childhood. The feeling of being very small in a place that is very old and that operates according to rules that were established long before I was born. My father's surgery was Monday. I drove him to the hospital in Marlinton and waited while they repaired his shoulder. It went well. He would need to stay overnight. I drove back to the hollow alone. I arrived at the house in the early evening. The sun was behind the western ridge. The hollow was in full shadow. I went inside, turned on the lights, started a fire in the wood stove, and made dinner. I ate alone at the kitchen table where I had eaten every meal of my childhood. The house was quiet around me. The hollow was quiet outside, the kind of quiet that precedes the deeper quiet, the one that comes when the forest goes still. After dinner, I stepped onto the back porch. The tree line was dark. The forest beyond it was silent, in the way that meant the ordinary sounds had been replaced by the extraordinary silence, the held breath stillness that I had now heard 3 nights in a row. I stood on the porch and I did something I cannot fully explain. I stepped off the boards and walked across the yard toward the tree line. I walked to the empty pallet at the edge of the mowed grass, to the exact spot where the wood had been, and I stood there and looked into the forest. The woods at night are not simply dark. They have a depth that daylight never reveals. The trunks are grey columns disappearing into a blackness that thickens with distance until it becomes absolute. The canopy is invisible above. The ground vanishes below. The forest at night is a space without boundaries, without reference points, without any of the visual information the human brain needs to feel safe. I stood at the edge and I looked in. I did not cross the tree line, but I looked and I kept looking, longer than the rules allowed, longer than anyone in this hollow had looked into these woods after dark in a very long time. Something looked back. I did not see it, not with my eyes. There was nothing to see, no shape, no movement, no reflection. But I felt it, a pressure, a focus, an awareness directed at me from somewhere in the dark between the trunks, not at the immediate edge, deeper, up the slope, maybe 50 yards in, maybe 100, in the old timber where the trees were massive and the spaces between them were cathedral-wide and lightless. Something was standing in the forest, and it was aware of me the way I was aware of it, not through sight, but through a sense that predates sight, the ancient mutual recognition that passes between two living things when they detect each other across a distance in the dark. The awareness had weight. I could feel it settle onto me the way cold air settles onto bare skin. It was not hostile. That was the thing that frightened me most. It was not hostile, and it was not friendly. It was attentive, patient, curious, maybe. The curiosity of something that has been watching a boundary for a very long time and has become interested when someone stands at the edge and does not immediately run. I stood there for about 30 seconds. Then the feeling shifted. Not a threat, a leaning, as if whatever was in the trees had taken one step closer without making a sound, had closed a fraction of the distance between us. Not to threaten, to see better, to get a clearer look at the person standing at the edge of its territory in the dark. I turned and walked back to the house. I did not run. My legs wanted to run. Every nerve in my body wanted to sprint across those 60 yards of open grass. But something deeper, some knowledge that might have been instinct or might have been the distilled wisdom of 6 generations of families who had lived alongside that tree line, told me not to. I walked at a steady pace. I stepped onto the porch. I opened the door. I went inside. I closed it behind me and locked it and went to the interior room and closed that door too. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and I did not move until morning. The next day, driving home from the hospital with my father, I told him what I had done. He drove with his good hand on the wheel and his injured arm in the sling, and his eyes on the road, and he did not say anything for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was careful. He told me that my grandmother, his mother, had done the same thing when she was young. Newly married, living in the hollow for the first time, not yet believing that the rules were anything more than mountain superstition. One October night, she walked to the tree line and looked in. She stood there for about a minute. My father said his mother told him that what looked back at her was not something she could describe because it did not present itself in terms that description could capture. It was not a shape. It was not a figure or a silhouette or a shadow. It was a presence, a density in the dark that had awareness behind it, the way a face has expression behind it. She said she understood in that moment that the rules were not about fear, they were about respect. The woods were not empty. Something lived in them that was older than the hollow and older than the families and older than the memory of anyone who had ever tried to put a name on it. And the rules were the agreement, the terms of coexistence that someone, a very long time ago, had worked out with whatever lived in the trees. You stay in the light. It stays in the dark. You acknowledge it once a year with the wood. It lets you live in the hollow without interference. My father said his mother followed the rules from that night forward and never broke them again. She lived in the hollow for 50 more years. She died in the house she was born in. The thing in the trees walked the ridge above her house every night of her life, and she slept through it because the agreement held. He looked at me then. He said, the agreement holds as long as both sides keep it. He said, the firewood was late this year, and that was partly my fault for being gone, and partly his fault for not asking for help. He said we were fortunate that putting the wood out when we did was enough. He said the thing in the woods was patient, and it was fair, and it had lived alongside the hollow for longer than anyone could know. But he said patience was not the same as forgiveness. He said the rules were the rules, and when they were not followed, the boundary moved. Not fast, not violently, but steadily. The footsteps came closer. The silence lasted longer. The feeling at the tree line grew heavier, and if the rules were ignored long enough, the boundary would reach the houses, and then the agreement would be broken, and nobody alive knew what came after that, because nobody had ever let it get that far. That was a week ago. I am back in Northern Virginia now. I am in my apartment in a suburb outside of DC, surrounded by traffic noise and street lights, and the constant ambient hum of a world that never goes fully dark and never goes fully quiet. I have returned to my job. I have returned to my life. The mountains are 4.5 hours behind me, but I am different now, and I know it. I stand at my apartment window at night and look out at the parking lot and the strip mall and the highway overpass, and I think about the hollow. I think about the tree line 60 yards from the back porch. I think about the weight of something watching me from the dark with an attention that was not hostile, but was not safe either. The attention of something very old and very patient, deciding whether to be curious or something else entirely. I have started calling my father every week, not just about the shoulder, about the firewood, about the rules, about whether the sounds on the ridge are normal, at the usual distance, following the usual schedule. My father answers these questions with the steady patience he has always had, the patience of a man who has lived his whole life alongside something he cannot see, and has made his peace with it the way you make peace with a mountain or a river, not by understanding it, but by respecting what it can do. I know I will go back, not to visit, to stay. Maybe not now, maybe not for years, but eventually, because the hollow needs people who follow the rules, and the families there are aging. And one day my father will not be able to swing a maul, or stack a cord, or walk the tree line in the evening to make sure the boundary is maintained. Someone will need to take that over. Someone who grew up with the rules and knows what they mean and understands what happens when they are not kept. I lie in bed at night in my apartment with the window cracked open and the sound of traffic on the highway mixing with the hum of the air conditioning. It is a world away from the hollow. There is nothing outside my window but pavement and cars and the electric glow of a place that has paved over its darkness so completely that most people have forgotten the dark was ever there. But sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the traffic thins and the wind dies and the noise of the world drops just low enough, I feel something underneath the silence. Not a sound, not footsteps, a feeling, a low, faint awareness at the very bottom of perception, like the vibration of something vast and patient turning its attention toward me from a long distance away. I close the window when that happens. I turn on the television. I let the noise fill the room and push the feeling back below the threshold where I can pretend it is not there. But I know what it is. It is the hollow. It is the ridge. It is the thing in the trees reminding me, gently, across 400 miles and a lifetime of distance, that the agreement is still in place and the rules still apply, and the firewood will need to be split again next October, and someone will need to stack it at the edge of the tree line and walk back to the house before dark and not watch what comes to collect it. I lie in bed and I feel the awareness fade, and I think about the hollow and the house and the tree line and the dark. I think about my father on the porch in the evening, looking at the ridge the way his mother looked at it, and her mother before her, with the calm attention of people who understand that the world is larger than what they can see, and that some of what shares it with them is very old and very near, and has been keeping its end of the agreement since before anyone thought to ask its name. Next October, I will drive south. I will split the wood. I will stack it at the edge of the trees, and I will walk back to the house before the light goes, and I will close the door, and I will listen to the footsteps come down the slope in the dark and carry it away, piece by piece, up into the deep timber where no one goes. That is the agreement. That is the rule. And the rule is all we have ever needed.